You're listening to the Literary Atlanta podcast. I'm Allison Law. Sunday night, close to 30 million people tuned in to a hostless 91st Academy Awards. Those ratings, according to Nielsen, were much higher than last year's televised Oscars. And yet, instead of dressing up and watching the red carpet arrivals and interminable thank you speeches at our friend's annual Oscars party, yes, I'm talking about you, Eric, I was at home in my elastic waist pants, TV off, and working. That is until Zach got home and we watched the finale of season 3 of True Detective on HBO. Now that was some Mahershala I got into. If you haven't watched seasons 1 and 3, skip season 2. Try True Detective. And then let's discuss it because I have a lot of feelings about the way the show works. I digress. If people around the world aren't tuning in to watch the celebrities at the Oscars, then they're tuning in to watch the celebrities at a royal wedding. According to Forbes, the ratings were about the same for the wedding of Prince Harry to Meghan Markle in May 2018 as that Oscars number I just gave you. More than 29 million people watched the festivities live across 15 different broadcast and cable networks. More people watched their wedding than the nuptials of Harry's older brother, Prince William, to Kate Middleton in 2011. Neither of these ceremonies, though, garnered the audience that Queen, then Princess Elizabeth. Now, I checked several different websites to verify the statistic. Most of them came back with the same number. Here's what I found. The BBC recorded and broadcasted Elizabeth's wedding ceremony to 200 million people around the world. I guess that makes sense because there were fewer TV channels back then, no YouTube, no social media, no Netflix. I wish I'd thought to verify this 200 million viewer statistic when I interviewed this week's guest. I'm sure it came up during her research on Elizabeth and Philip's royal wedding. You see, Jennifer Robson has written an historical novel about the significance of this wedding and why an event that could be viewed as frivolous and over the top was so important to a country, to a continent really, that was just 2 years past World War II. The book is called The Gown, and my conversation with author Jennifer Robson is next on episode 55 of Literary Atlanta. Atlanta is a book town, home to avid readers and host to some of the finest writers and storytellers on the planet. That's my thesis statement, and this podcast provides the supporting details through behind-the-scenes anecdotes, author interviews, and all of the ways that you can experience the rich literary landscape right here in Literary Atlanta. If you're like me and adore the Netflix original series, The Crown, then you need to read a new book called The Gown. Don't get them confused because they rhyme. One is a TV series starring Claire Foy as a young Queen Elizabeth. It begins in season 1 with her wedding to Prince Philip. And, tying back into our Oscars intro, newly minted Academy Award winner for Best Actress Olivia Colman will assume the more mature version of Elizabeth in upcoming episodes of The Crown. Now, The Gown is the most recent novel from international best-selling author and historian Jennifer Robson. While Elizabeth and some members of the royal family have cameos in this book, The Gown weaves together the story of two women who find themselves in England in 1947 working on the most incredible bridal trousseau of its time. They are hand-embroidering the gown and all its accoutrements as designed by royal dresser Norman Hartnell. Jennifer has written 5 other novels, among them Somewhere in France and Goodnight from London. She holds a doctorate in British Economic and Social History from St. Antony's College, University of Oxford. I wanted to have her on the podcast as soon as I learned that she would be visiting Atlanta on book tour. For this conversation, Jennifer joined me via Skype from her home in Ontario. We began by talking about the 3 different narrators and 2 different timelines found in the novel. The story is told from 3 separate narrators. You have Anne, who is British, and she's living in Barking, Essex, outside of London.
Yeah.
And then you have Miriam, who is French, and she's just emigrated to England and is trying to find her way. And this is 1947, so 2 years after World War II.
Mm-hmm. And an extraordinarily bleak time to have been alive, in the sense that victory had been assured. They had won the war, but at a tremendous, tremendous cost. And so Britain was beggared after the war. The treasury was effectively empty. There were great swaths of the cities, not only London, but all the major cities across Britain that were in ruins, and there was no money to fix them. And just the wartime constraints of rationing, which I think a lot of people had fondly hoped would be over with the end of hostilities, continued because there were still so many shortages. And so food was rationed, fuel was rationed, and clothing was rationed. And so into this bleak time, and when we think of the polar vortex we had recently across the States and Canada, they had a very, very difficult winter, the winter of 46, 47 in Britain, where it was Canadian style weather in a country where very few houses had anything resembling central heating, and there was a coal shortage to begin with. So even maintaining a fire in the sitting room was difficult. And people were freezing to death in their homes. And then by the time that long and horrendous winter had finished, when the thaw came in the spring, there was terrible flooding across the nation. So there were almost these biblical weather events afflicting Britain, on top of the shortages, the dour reality of day-to-day life. And that was the world I had decided to set my book in. But that's a pretty grim backdrop for a novel.
Definitely.
And I didn't want the whole book to feel grim and dour and that it would be an endurance feat. There had to be a counterpoint. And with any good story, there are always contrasts that you have to establish. And to me, in some ways, when I thought of it, there could be no greater contrast than that between the everyday life that most people experienced in those years and the glamour and the stardust of this royal wedding. And that's where I began, effectively with the question of what was it like the day after VE Day, when everyone kind of woke up, had a terrible hangover, presumably, and then had to get back to rebuilding their lives. And the answer is that it was very, very difficult, but that in 1947 in particular, there was this one event that lifted people's spirits, even people who were somewhat skeptical of the royal family and might not have been as fond of the king and queen as the average Briton. Even the most reluctant observers found themselves swept along, as I believe a lot of us are with the modern royal weddings. It's very hard not to get swept up by the pageantry we saw with Harry and Meghan's wedding.
Right.
And, it's infectious. And I for one, I'm going to have to be honest and admit that I fall for it every time. And for both the recent royal weddings, both Will and Harry's, I was up at the crack of dawn with my girlfriends. We were wearing our fascinators, sitting in our pajamas, toasting them. And
like Heather's mom.
Exactly. And that's, of course, it was a thinly veiled reference to myself, really, when I was talking about how Heather's mom loved the royal family. And so that's the contrast between those two is where I knew I could find the place for my characters to inhabit.
The thing that I liked too was that Miriam is an outsider, and she does not understand why people are so excited about this wedding and about this gown. And she has this pivotal conversation where she finally gets it with Walter.
Yeah.
Where, he was talking about the circumstances that you were explaining earlier, that this was a horrible, bleak time, that this was a conversation that you actually had when you were kind of thinking through the book and what you were going to write about next, is it not?
Yeah, because the whole question of how did people go on? How did they manage to get through and have some level of hope for the future? Things like weddings, no matter whether they're a family wedding or it's a national or international occasion like a royal wedding, it's very hard not to feel hopeful over the course of a day like that, and maybe for that hope to trickle on and stay with us a little bit after the fact. I knew from the beginning I needed an outsider such as Miriam so that I could have a little dose of, how should I put it, lemon juice to kind of to cut through the sugar of a royal wedding. Because it can be very saccharine at times, the whole, everyone being obsessed over the gown and the flowers and the pageantry and all of the pomp that goes along with it. And I needed Miriam there to say, really? Really. And as Miriam says in the book, well, we kind of got rid of our royal family some time ago. So I'm at a loss as to understand why you're all so obsessed with these people eating off their gold plates in their castles.
Right. The whole democracy versus monarchy.
Yeah.
Positioning.
A successful royal family can be a very unifying force, and nobody does that better than the British royal family, in the sense that if you look at them, particular to this time period, the king and queen were a source of great comfort and great feelings of unity in Britain, because they had stayed. They didn't leave. They stayed. Buckingham Palace was bombed. The king's brother was killed. And there is a sense among most people in Britain that the royal family belonged to them and was in a way their family as well. Hence the great affection that people held Princess Elizabeth. And they wanted to see her have, their own daughters may not have been able to have a beautiful wedding, and very few people could in those days. But if their own daughters couldn't, then they certainly still wanted Princess Elizabeth to have a beautiful wedding.
That was one of the details that has stuck with me after reading the gown that you managed to weave into the story, was that everyone in England is subject to rations, and they used ration coupons, and that everyday people were mailing their ration coupons to the royal family.
It did happen. Yeah, it was very touching. And notwithstanding the fact that it was legal to clip coupons out of your ration book and give them to someone else, thousands of people who sent their coupons to the princess, and they had to be sent back. She wasn't allowed to use them, but everyone who sent them in apparently got a lovely little note from a lady in waiting saying thank you. And the coupons were returned. And then what happened is in the House of Commons, there was a special vote to ensure that there's a special allowance of extra coupons for the princess so that she could have her gown and not have to make do with, say, her military uniform or something, which would have been, I think, rather depressing to see her walk down the aisle in her military uniform.
So we have Anne and we have Miriam, who are in 1947.
Yeah.
And then the third narrator is Heather, who's living in Toronto, and it's 2016.
Yeah.
Did you know that you were going to have the different narrators in alternating timelines, or did they appear at different times?
That is such a good question. So the honest answer is that Heather only came to me fairly late in the day. Yeah. And it was, I had imagined from the beginning that the gown would be a straightforward historical narrative set in 1947. And then bits of myself kept piping up, and in a way, I felt as if I wanted to be part of the story, but I didn't want it to be me, but maybe a younger, significantly cooler and kind of a version of me. I'm almost 50, but if I were to have been in my late 20s at the time of a few years ago, then I imagine this is maybe I would have a life somewhat similar to Heather's. And I for that, I put her in the same part of Toronto where I live, and the supermarket where we first meet Heather is in fact the same supermarket that I shop in every week. So there are little bits and pieces, but I just felt that one thing that came very clear to me as I was writing the book was that I needed to know what became of these two women, and I couldn't stretch the narrative into a 70-year arc, but I still needed to know, and the only way to find out was to have a descendant of one of them and be present for part of the story. And, I lost my own grandmother a few years ago. I was very, very attached to her. And there's still parts of her life that I know nothing of, and I never will. She was a journalist herself, and as such was somewhat reticent about talking about herself.
Wow.
And it just made me think of what it's like to have lost somebody and to have loved them, to your soul's depth, and realize that you don't really know them. That's where that's the point at which I knew Heather had to be part of the story.
That's certainly the predicament that she is in, because I don't think I'm spoiling anything, because it says it's early in the book that we learn that she is the granddaughter of Anne from 1947. And in 2016, Anne has just passed away, and she arrived at that place that you just talked about. Like this is someone I was extremely close to, but there were a lot of basic details of her life. Like they didn't even know what her maiden name was. They just didn't know certain details of her life because she had immigrated from England to Canada.
I've had people question and say, how could she have kept these secrets? How could she have done these things? And I think if you dig into your own family's history, and this is certainly true with my family and my husband's family, is that especially when people leave one country for another, what they leave behind and what they bring will often surprise you. And quite often there are terrible traumas in people's past that the only way they can escape is by crossing to the other side of the world. And certainly in the late 1940s, and without giving anything away, there are events that propel Anne to Canada eventually. Certainly reading accounts of the time and how people conducted themselves, how they established their friendships with one another, the kind of things people talked about with their closest friends. And I know it's hard, especially for younger readers, to believe, but 50, 60, 70 years ago, it was not very common to share the deepest secrets of your heart with someone else. It's perfectly possible for two women to be friends for many, many years and to never discuss on a very, very deep level what their heartbreaks were and what their tragedies were. People were often very reticent about their personal lives. When I contrast that with the way that, my children, a teenager and a tween, are just completely open books with their friends. And the notion of privacy is something that I'm always constantly having to revisit with them. And that privacy, is something to be cherished, and to just kind of toss it away. You really think hard before sharing things with the world.
Well, and you've revealed to the reader details about each of these three women's lives that the other characters don't really learn until later, which is always something that I marvel at in historical fiction that's really well done like this. Like, how do you reveal information in different places and with different characters and not spoil the experience?
It's with a lot of help from a wonderful editor. I'll be honest. And typically if you were to read one of my first drafts, which come in looking pretty messy, I probably am giving away too much too early. And it's only with the help of my editor. And also, in all fairness, when you've handed in a first draft, the best thing you can do is leave it alone for a little bit and walk away and then come back to it. And typically it's through the layers of editing that I know where I need to add things and where I need to remove them, just to sustain a sense of tension throughout the book. And for me, the issue of point of view is really paramount. My characters can only see through their own eyes. They can't imagine or experience the world through somebody else's eyes. Anything that they impart to us or to one another, I have to be very careful that I'm not jumping from one character's head to another, and that I'm maintaining that point of view fairly strictly, so that if Anne Anne may be aware of something, but then I have to make the decision, when does she share the knowledge of this particular fact or event with someone else? And to do so judiciously. So it's, again, not some kind of info dump, bestie sharing all in one big torturous conversation.
Right.
But it is one of these things where, as writers, we all struggle in the fine tuning stage, where quite often I'll think I'll have done something. I'll think that I've doled out little bits and pieces of information that are leading the reader in a certain direction, and then I realize that I've just imagined that I've done that, and my editor says, "You need to get us from A to B, Jen. Come on, you forgot that one stage." And that's when I go in, and sometimes it's just a few words, sometimes it's a paragraph, just to make the wayfinding clear for the reader without hitting you over the head. I mean,
yeah. Yeah.
The place I begin when I'm writing is to assume and to believe. You're smart people. I don't need to hit you over the head with information. I also can't just assume that you're going to somehow be able to divine from my thoughts that a character acted in a certain way or felt a certain way. I have to put that there on the page. So it's a balancing act. Everything to do with writing is about standing on that tightrope and not losing your balance.
Mm. So how much did you know about embroidery prior to starting your research and writing the gown?
When I was in my 20s and early 30s before I had my kids, one of my favorite things to do as a hobby was to do embroidery. Not the sort of very, very fine embroidery that you see here in this book. The best embroidery in the world right now, I would argue, is being done in places like India and Pakistan, where bridal finery is often heavily embroidered and done beautifully, beautifully. And also in China. Chinese embroiderers are doing some incredible work these days. My kind of embroidery was things like counted cross stitch and silk ribbon embroidery, and needlepoint. It was nothing innovative or new. But I know my way around a needle and a piece of thread and a piece of fabric. But what I didn't know was how to do the very, very fine embroidery that I describe. I didn't have a sense of what it was like to sit at one of those frames and work all day with very, very exacting concentration on a single motif. And so that's what sent me to London, to this incredible place called Hand and Lock, which has been open for more than 250 years, to learn from one of their master embroiderers, a young French woman called Juliette Ferry, how to do this embroidery. Now, I know how to do it. Am I a skilled embroiderer? No, but I have an idea from working with Juliette, and I actually, over the course of the one day I spent there, a very long day, I recreated a single motif from the wedding gown, so that I could just have a sense of what it took to create these works of art.
Wow. I was just going back through the pages of my copy of the book and looking at places where I had highlighted, embroidered whip stitches and basting stitches and, just terms of art for this really intricate embroidery that these women were doing for Mr. Hartnell.
Yeah. I knew more than a civilian, so to speak, but quite a bit less than an actual expert. I was in that the interested amateur level of expertise. Could I do this kind of work day in, day out as my job? I don't think so. Not because it's not interesting. It is very, very interesting work. I just don't have the eyesight for it anymore. I had to use magnifying glasses when I was working on it, and I've comprehensively ruined my eyesight over 20 odd years of sitting in archives and peering at computer screens.
Yeah. Well, join the club.
Yeah. The way I spend my time is enough to make my eye doctor faint without adding in embroidery.
Mm-hmm. What I have read on your author page, and then certainly what I've read through the character of Anne in the gown, that you have a green thumb, or that you at least know quite a bit about gardening.
A decent amount. I worked many, many years ago, very briefly, as an editor at a gardening magazine. And this is long before I had a garden of my own. I was in my 20s and lived in a tiny apartment. So I had a windowsill, but no garden. And I've kept up that interest in gardening, and I would say it's not a garden the likes of which a true expert would necessarily be enthralled by. But I love my little garden, and I spend once the weather here in Canada gets warm enough to spend tons of time outside, I'm out there for months. And if I'm not actually doing the work of gardening, I'm sitting and admiring my roses, and I've managed to keep some of my beautiful English roses alive through these Canadian winters, and I have a couple of peonies, which I had to work into the gown, so they're kind of a recurring motif that appear here and there.
I'm so glad that you did that, because the peony is one of my favorites too. It was a perfect metaphor for Miriam.
Yeah, and the idea of a person as well as a flower being able to bloom given the right circumstances. And that's what I tried to have happen for Miriam over the course of the gown, is to see somebody whose life is pretty desolate at the beginning of the book. And she moves away from that. And I don't want to belabor the metaphor too much, but she moves into a place of sunnier days by the time I'm done telling her story.
Yes. And it kind of it switches from time to time throughout the story too.
Yeah.
Will you talk a little bit more about your research process? Because one of your other professions is historian and academic. And I can imagine that when you begin one of these projects that it's like, oh boy, I can't wait to just dive into all of the research and learn as much as I possibly can.
It's tempting to just kind of go for it. Mm-hmm. And what I've learned over the years is that I wouldn't say slow and steady, but a measured approach is smart, because if you don't know the general history of the period, it's very hard to talk about the detailed history of the period. And so when people ask me, what's a good way, broadly speaking, to go about doing historical research, the kind of the approach that I take, which the average historian or indeed the average writer of historical fiction would take, it's almost an archaeological approach in the sense that you're excavating layer by layer. And so where I begin, if I don't know a period very well, or it may be just a subset of the history in question that I'm not familiar with, I start with general histories. So I would start with general histories of the Second World War, of Britain in the Second World War. And then, what I do as an historian, when I open a book, I turn to the end. I turn to the bibliography, because that's where the writer of the book I'm holding got her or his information. And so, I'll read the book and then I look at the bibliography and see where are the breadcrumbs leading me. And those will lead me, typically the next level is more specialized histories. So, for example, if I went from a broad history of the Second World War, then I'd look at a broad history of Britain in the Second World War. And then maybe go from there to the Blitz. Once I've kind of exhausted the history in the sense of the books written by historians, that's when I start to move closer and closer to the primary sources, which are the gold dust that historical fiction is built upon. Sources that reflect the immediate voice of people who lived in the past. And so it's things like taped interviews. It's people's memoirs, their diaries, anything that offers as unfiltered an account as possible of events that took place at a certain place in time. Newspapers are a fantastic source of information, not because the news in them is necessarily accurate or useful, because it's all written through a lens of somebody's perspective, but the approach the newspaper takes and the journalism within it to the problems of the day and the kind of things that it prints as a reflection of what people were interested in is very interesting to me as an historian. And things like advertisements are a goldmine.
Oh, sure.
If you want to know what movies people were watching or what clothes they were wearing, that's one way to start figuring it out, bearing in mind that a lot of advertisements are aspirational. They cater to making people feel better about themselves. And so bit by bit, I kind of chip away at the layers and hoping to get down to the bedrock, as it were, which is the immediate voices of people in the past and the experiences that they remember and can describe. Where I ran into problems with the gown is that I, for the longest time, was not able to get in touch with anyone who had worked at Hartnell.
Right.
I was not able to find any memoirs of people who'd worked there. And it was really at the 11th hour when I was in London learning how to do this embroidery that I was put in touch with Betty Foster, who worked on the gown.
Isn't that incredible? I was reading that in the PS section of the gown, how you were talking about your research trip to the Hand and Lock, and that you just happened to be there at the same time that a documentary film crew was there to shoot a very royal wedding.
Yeah, Yeah, Betty made it into the final documentary. Juliette and I were left on the cutting room floor, but who cares, really? It's a very entertaining documentary, I have to say. It was very well done, and just the serendipity that led to that moment, and to my being able to have the honor of speaking with this lady who is lovely. She is lovely inside and out. She's just a delightful, delightful person. I just love her to bits. And I'm so grateful to her because I was at the point where I was starting to feel a little panicked that I would not be able to research this book as thoroughly as I'd done my previous books, and that there would be empty spaces, and that I might have to wallpaper over, the spaces that I didn't know. And it felt dishonest to me. Mm-hmm. And I was really feeling quite panicked. And then for Betty to kind of take my hand and to lead me to the doors of these workrooms that had been closed for decades, and to open the door, hold me through with her. And it was like going into a time machine. It was incredible. Yeah, I've been a historian, ever since I guess I was in first year history at university. And my wonderful first year history professor, I had actually thought I would not be an historian because everyone told me I had to be because my dad was a history professor and, teenagers are rebels, right? Forget it, as if I'm going to do that. And then I had my first year history class with Professor Paul Webb at King's University College in London, Ontario. And it blew me away. And I've been a historian since then. And that was in 1988. Mm-hmm. The time I spent with Betty was hands down the most satisfying, the most meaningful experience I've had.
Why?
It was that I was holding, like sitting next to and effectively holding hands with somebody who was part of the story that I was writing about. And my wonderful dad, who's now retired, but was a history professor for many, many years, and the kind of teacher that people, 30 years later, they still recall classes with him and how wonderful he was. He has a thing called the handshake game. Okay. And so the handshake game is to establish a link between yourself and a person who is the farthest away in history possible, and to do it through a series of direct handshakes. And the key to this is for you, or ideally, a close member of your family, say a grandparent or something, to have met at some point a high-ranking member of the British royal family, because that if you can shake hands, say with the Queen, mm-hmm. Then you know that in her lifetime, she's had the opportunity to shake hands with really every person of significance on the planet. But in her own family, you can, they're great at the handshakes and not so much the public hugs. So you can go back to her grandfather, George the Fifth, and then from him to his grandmother, Queen Victoria, and then from Queen Victoria on backwards. And I think at one point my dad had established a link through, this is when he talked about when he was at Oxford in the 60s and various people he met. He established a direct link between himself and Lawrence of Arabia, because one of the people he met when he was at Oxford in 1961 was Lawrence of Arabia's brother. Yeah, and that's not going back super far in time, but it's certainly going back to a towering figure in modern history. Definitely. I've done that when I go to schools. I'll talk to the school children and say, let's play the handshake game. And more specifically, it's to link through me to link them with a veteran of the Great War. Because when I was a guide at the Canadian National War Memorial at Vimy Ridge in France, where the Canadian soldiers fought a very pivotal battle in 1917. And for us as Canadians, it has kind of extreme importance even to this day. When I was there in 1989, I met and shook the hands of men who'd been on that battlefield that day. So then quite often what I'll do with the kids is I'll go up to the one who's closest to me and I'll shake their hand and I'll say, so through me, you have a link to a man who fought in the First World War. Mm. And then every kid in the class has to shake hands so that it goes around and there's a continuous line. I think it's an effective game, really. Because through our own grandparents, we can have these incredible connections with the past, right? And all you need is for one of your grandparents to have had the chance to meet a president. And there you go. I mean, just think of all the possibilities that opens up.
I love that. The handshake game.
Yeah. I mean, even through presidents, I mean, it's typical, except when sadly somebody's been assassinated. But you can, one president will shake the hand of another as he's leaving office. Well, you can go back to Abraham Lincoln effectively, if you pick and choose, the line connecting handshakes. So it's an interesting party game to play.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, never met any member of the royal family, but I have met people who have. So I figure that's my entree into getting my way back to Queen Victoria.
Yeah. Well, has Betty Foster read The Gown?
She has. I sent her an early copy in about August or so. And then when I visited her at the end of November, I was there to meet my UK publisher and to do some other fun things, including seeing Meghan's dress on display at Windsor Castle. And it was incredible.
Yeah.
And so I took Betty and her family to lunch, and I brought over a pile of books for them. And to my very great relief, she loves it. I was very anxious for her to like the book. And one thing I did, which I mentioned in the essay at the back of the book, is I add Betty to the story. This was completely with her permission. Mm-hmm. The actual day of the royal wedding, she had a little ticket that she and the other girls from Hartnell had been given to stand just outside the palace gates, right up at the front. And it was a special cordoned off area for people who'd worked on the gown. And so she was standing outside, and she saw the princess and the king go by in the carriage. And originally I thought I would just leave it at that. Then I asked her, would she mind if I took her from there and put her inside the palace on the day? So in the scene set at the palace on the wedding day, Miriam is helping the bridesmaids get dressed. She's there just in case of any last minute disasters with, pearls popping loose from the embroidery. And when that doesn't happen, she helps, get the bridesmaids into their quite elaborate gowns. And she and the girl who's with her, who is Betty, finish up, and they have a moment where they're able to stand and look out the windows along the Mall and see the princess and the king in the carriage driving away towards Westminster Abbey. And I know I was playing with the facts, but I figure it was with Betty's permission. And I wanted her to be there because I felt she deserved to be inside the palace that day.
I love that story. HarperCollins, Jennifer's U.S. publisher of The Gown, includes these rich PS sections with additional content in the back of many of their paperbacks. In the PS section of The Gown, you'll find the essay that Jennifer wrote about her fateful meeting with Betty Foster and an interview with Betty. There's also a recipe for Miriam's Grand Marais Friday night chicken. Jennifer Robson will be at Foxtail Bookshop in Woodstock tonight at 6:30. She'll be in conversation with the wonderful Mary Kay Andrews. Unfortunately, I have a conflict tonight. I will be moderating a discussion between Algonquin authors B.A. Shapiro, whose most recent novel is The Collector's Apprentice, and Tim Johnston, whose book that just published is The Current. I expect a lively and fun discussion tonight at 7 at the Margaret Mitchell House in Midtown. I'd love to see you there, but promise that we'll record the conversation for a future episode of Literary Atlanta. Remember, when you can, support these local booksellers and the authors they're hosting by buying a copy of the book at the event. Thanks for listening to this episode. As always, you can find links to the people, books, and events mentioned in the podcast on our website. That's literaryatlanta.com. You can listen to episodes there or download them wherever you like to get your podcast. Apple Podcast, Google Play, YouTube, Stitcher, Radio Public, or TuneIn. I'm Allison Law, your host. Until next time, take care and stay lit curious.